Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, there was a lot of protests, obviously, at the end of last year and at the spring of this year across Europe on a number of different issues, largely to do with their livelihoods being at threat and also government policies restricting them in terms of their ability to grow crops. Um, that has eased a little bit in terms of number of protests, but I think that's largely because of seasonal, because it's harvest time. Farmers are obviously
Yeah.
very, very busy at this time of year. But the issues still remain in a lot of ways. I think from the UK point of view, there's a number of issues. I set up No Farmers, No Food in the spring, which initially was just going to be a social media feed. And then because the amplification of that, I put together a group of steering groups of farmers covering all different sectors of farming. And we've worked out, what our core issues would be. And we're actually sort of building a lot of content behind the scenes at the moment. But there's an element whereby with farming campaigns, it does come in waves of awareness because of the seasonal approach for farmers and when they've got time to get involved in protests. But if you look at the different components in the UK, in Wales, for instance, they've got two major issues, which is, for instance, the TB issue, which is devastating livestock farmers in Wales, and bad government policy from the Welsh government, which, if it's replicated by the UK government, which it could well be because it's both Labour, then that's going to have a huge impact with English farmers as well. You've also got the issue in Wales with the SFS policy, whereby even the government's own impact report, thousands of jobs would have been lost and livestock would have been lost. But because of the pressure put on by our campaign, but also the collective forces of the Welsh farmers, that was put into the long grass by the Welsh government. So that was a success. But you've got problems in terms of underfunding of committed budgets across the UK, in Wales and Scotland and at Westminster. So that's another issue. You've still got issues with the subsidy rollouts, which are fundamentally attached to aspects of climate stipulations and environmental sustainability. So you've got also the lack of flood protection, say in Lincolnshire, with the cuts to the Environment Agency, which hasn't been addressed. You've also got the supermarkets issue with unfair pricing to farmers. And meanwhile, consumers are getting ripped off on the other side. You've got cheap imports and poor regulation as well. So you've got a multitude of issues and many more. And then you've got the most social aspects, such as mental health issues and economic issues. And a lot of farmers are concerned whether they're still going to be around in 12 months. So these campaign topics haven't gone away. They're all still live topics. And it's something that, we're splitting out all the components of those. We're continuing to discuss them on our social media feeds and all the media outlets that the farmers in my group are doing. Ultimately, the group No Farmers, No Food is driven by farmers, for farmers, and also wider public understanding. And that's where we're at. We've been so taken aback by the support on this. And we've got a great identity. We've got some good campaigns. We've got the right people involved, farmers who really know their stuff and can express their concerns and are relating to the public. But ultimately, it comes down to this. Most blue-collar industries have been decimated over the last 30, 40 years. In particular, the catalyst for that was in the 80s. What's left in terms of blue-collar industries and major assets is farmers and also farmland. And so we've now got an issue whereby governments seem more concerned about giving our tax money to corporations or giving them sort of incentives and opportunities to asset grab. The perfect example of that with this Labour government is their slavish approach to net zero. In particular, one example, solar panels, which Ed Miliband has already commissioned some major solar panel schemes which go against local community concerns on prime agricultural land. And one of our core campaign messages is that no solar panels on a mass scale should be put on prime agricultural land. Put them on brownfields, put them on, car parks or whatever. But our food supply should never be compromised on the altar of net zero.
Yeah, and James, I was going to bring that up actually, but also in the context of, trying to make sense of government policy, because look, I think to me, this is a little bit like the energy policy, strategic energy policy, which has been non-existent in the UK for the past 20 years. Anybody looking at the sector will agree with that, because the government's telling everyone to drive electric cars, and yet the electricity grid is telling people to turn off their devices in the winter, otherwise we're going to have a blackout. It's absolute shambles. And it seems to me that there is this confusion in government as well, because you've just brought up one of the things, which is solar panels, huge, great farms. being put on prime agricultural land at a time when we're talking about, we don't want to ship things across the world. We've got our own land here to grow things, but also the government is actually encouraging people to leave farming. So if you're an older farmer, you can actually get a huge payout to leave farming and just leave the sector altogether. So, James, have you heard any politician give you any kind of credible sort of explanation for what the UK's strategic policy is for farming?
There isn't one. I mean, if you look at the Labour manifesto, I think there's 87 words mentioned about farming in it. Now, government policy goes in a number of different directions, but one of the key components should always be protection of our farming and our food security. It should be right at the top, because it's not just about protecting farmers and land, it's also about the wealth in terms of health of a nation. So, we want fresh produce. So farmers are obviously getting hamstrung by the agreements with supermarkets, who are basically fleecing them with underpricing them in terms of buying up their produce. But there needs to be other big supply routes. Like, for instance, there's an opportunity for major supply routes with public sector, in particular the footfall of schools and hospitals. Instead of, again, local authorities and governments issuing major corporate contracts out on the supply of food here, and sometimes with, ultra-processed food, local farmers should be getting top of the list of procurement contracts for this. It gives them another supply route. So therefore, there's also debate about well-being and nutrition, and that comes from local farms. So yes, I think it's great there's farmers markets everywhere, but they need mass supply routes, and the other opportunity is the public sector.
Yeah, and James, are you suspicious at all? Because on energy policy, for example, I'm really suspicious that it's not the fact that there is just no sort of strategic policy. It's the fact, actually, that the strategic policy is just to get us out of our cars altogether. And this whole bugger's muddle which is being created is part of that. It's going to become too expensive and too difficult to drive whatsoever. I'm suspicious that the same thing is happening with farming, because, you got people like Gates, who are, and not just Gates, but he's the obvious target, obviously, that are talking about more processed food. So making our meats in factories, making other types of foods in factories. And, there's a part of me which thinks, well, is that the direction we're going in? It's just that the UK government doesn't want to explain that to citizens. Do you think, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there is. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's like there's mission creeps in terms of undermining certain sectors so they can get control of the asset and pass it on to corporations. Now, this has been going back 40 years. I mean, if you look at our utilities, and, you look at our transport, you look at so many of the industries that are hollowed out in the 80s and the communities around them, and effectively the industries sold overseas. The same thing's happening slowly but surely with farming, whereby farmers, because of economic conditions, but also bad government or restrictive government policy, are getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So they end up having a zero-sum game. Do they just, see it through and, end up in more financial peril? Or do they sell up? And if they sell up, then you sell up to a potential renewable company. And you've meanwhile got the government, who are now doing net zero on steroids. And you've got Ed Miliband, for instance, in a time where our elderly, our pensioners, are losing their winter fuel allowance, 11.6 billion is being spent of British taxpayers' money into overseas climate aid, whatever that means. But effectively, it's a wealth transfer again. And so there's a debate that interlinks farming with a number of topics, interlinks with our energy policy, because of what's happening to their land with renewables, in particular solar panel use on agricultural land. It also links in with our housing policy, because again, farmers, if they get squeezed, the land can be given up for housing development. It also links into, huge big aspects of our food supply and also the health of our nation, about what we're actually eating. And do we actually want to go down the route of processed food? No, we don't. So it's ironic you get Keir Starmer saying we're going to ban smoking outside pubs, when there's nothing mentioned about what people, as a smoker, I'm a little bit annoyed about that. But also there needs to be a debate about what we're eating, and where is that food coming from? One thing we know about our local farmers in the UK is they adhere to the highest regulation standards of quality of food. And also, if you want to have a debate about the environment and emissions, then their transportation, if it's done locally, are going to cut down on that as well, instead of shipping it in from overseas. So the government has said very, very little on what they're doing on farming. Some of this will come out on the budget, which is going to affect farmers as well, especially if they put up, for instance, fuel duty. That's going to have an enormous effect on farmers as well. It's another price that they have to factor in terms of overall expenditure. So at the moment, it's a little bit of wait and see with the UK government, but there's already things in place that are huge warning signs. Fuel duty being possibly one of them, but also, for instance, solar panels and prime agricultural land.
Yeah, very well put there, James. James, for people watching that do recognise how important farm is and they want to help support the campaign, where do they go to sign up?
Well, there's going to be a number of stages. Firstly, go into social media. It's No Farms, No Foods, but it's under the auspice of No Farmers, No Food. That's on X. It's also on Facebook as well. It's also on Instagram. There is a website coming very soon. We're trying to, it's all done in our spare time for no cost and no funding. So we're building this website at the moment. Some of the campaigns are brought out of that. We've got about 15 farmers on the steering group who are interacting with the feed as well. But the first place at the moment with more content to come is our X feed.
Fantastic. Get yourselves over to there. No Farmers, No Food, and give it a follow. And James, hopefully we'll see some more farmers re-emerging after the harvest in the winter again to start shouting about what's going on, because it was really positive, I think, all of that action that we've seen over the last 18 months in the UK and in Europe. James Melville, thank you so much for coming on the Freeman Report. Thank you.
You are about to hear
today's News Talk and the voice of freedom. We're today's News Talk, TNT.